The Ten Commandments never saved anyone. They weren't intended to. They're intended to teach the people of God how to live. Does that mean they have no value to the rest of the world? Does that mean the Ten Commandments are useless for the entire world? No, not at all. Because as you look at the Ten Commandments, what you're going to see is that each of these commandments teaches us, not just us as the people of God, but all of humanity, teaches us something about the greatest struggles we have in life. The greatest sin struggles that we have as humanity. Think about this. As you think through each of the Ten Commandments, they teach us about the struggle we have to make God our first priority. Do we struggle with that? Probably if we look at our calendars or our checkbooks, we would say, yeah, I think sometimes I do struggle to make God my first priority. They teach us about our struggle to not define worship our way. This one's a tricky one, this graven image, because it's really easy for us in modern Western society where we don't really worship idols anymore, right? We kind of say, that's kind of silly. It's just stone or it's just wood. But really the issue here is not an issue of idol worship. It's an issue of what gets between you and your worship of God. Remember the golden calf that the Israelites built? They were not creating a new God. They were redefining God. They were saying, we're going to worship God through this golden calf. Moses said, no, number 2, you don't let anyone get between you and your worship of God. You know what I love? I absolutely love that when Jeremy and Jackie lead us in worship, they are very intentional. You might not know this. I'm telling you this because we talk about it in the office all the time. They are so intentional about getting out of the way, about making sure that they don't do anything that gets in the way of you worshiping God. And that's a culture that Jeremy is beginning to install across the board in our worship services. I love that we have a church where the people who are up here guiding us in music are making an effort to get out of the way so it's not about them, so they don't become an idol. What a wonderful blessing that is for us. Because it's so easy for us to let something get between us and our worship of God. Think about this. If you're worshiping God, it's impossible to be upset. If you're worshiping God, it's impossible to be upset about anyone or anything. Because if you are, something has gotten between you and your worship of God. And it's an idol. And so the commandments teach us about our struggle to not define our worship of God how we want to. They teach us about our struggle to not trivialize or misuse the name of God. And this is something that all people struggle with. About the struggle to not be consumed with the busyness of life. The struggle to not place ourselves under our God-given authority. The struggle to avoid hostility towards others. The struggle to remain faithful and pure. The struggle to not gain advantage at the expense of others. Stealing is more than just taking something from the corner store. Stealing is me gaining an advantage for myself at the expense of someone else. That's stealing. They teach us about the struggle to always be honest. You know, you can use words that are true and not be an honest person. Our kids are masters at this. You know, they say things that are true, but they're not being honest. And the Ten Commandments open our eyes to that struggle. They open our eyes to the struggle that we all have to not always want more. As we think of these 10 struggles of life that the Ten Commandments highlight, we need to realize that we are the people of God. Paul tells us in Romans that we as the church have been grafted into the family of Abraham. And so just as the children of Israel were God's called out people, we too are God's adopted children. Through the work of Jesus, he brought us into his family. And so as the people of God, we need to give great consideration to the Ten Commandments to say, if these are the household rules of God's people, what do they mean for me? And I want to suggest that we need to see these commands as more than just negative sins to avoid. That's the easy way to look at these commands and say, it's a bunch of thou shalt nots, and it's just sins that I need to avoid. But Jesus made it clear in the Sermon on the Mount that the 10 Commandments are much more than that. Do you remember the Sermon on the Mount? He kept saying, you have heard it said, but I say to you. For example, he said, you have heard it said, thou shalt not kill. But I say to you, if you hate your brother, you've broken that command. And so these commands are more than just sins to avoid. They also highlight virtues that we are to pursue. Every one of the 10 Commandments highlights a virtue that we as the family of God should be pursuing in our life. Not just sins to avoid, but virtues to pursue. And I want to suggest this morning that there are two primary virtues that are foundational to the 10 Commandments. The first is the virtue of trust. We need to trust God's love and power. And the second is contentment. We need to be content with God's provision. I think these two virtues, trust and contentment, are at the very heart of God's law, at the very heart of what it means to be a Christian. And if we can wrap our hands around what it means to trust and be content, what we will find is a freedom in living for Christ that we've never experienced before. We need to trust God's power and his love. You know, I think we've all experienced this, that obedience, and we see this with parents and children, obedience is much easier when you trust the person you're supposed to obey. When you trust that they're looking out for your best interest, when you trust that they want what is best for you, when you trust that they have the ability to provide that, it's much easier to obey. I want you to imagine that I have this great game that I play with my son. That every so often, when Liam least expects it, and he's running past me doing something, I trip him. See, this is funny. You know, you think about how much fun you could have with this, because he never knows it's coming. You know, he's running through the house, chasing the dog or something, and he goes zipping by me in the kitchen, and I just, and we've got all hardwood floors, so he just slides right into the cabinet, maybe hits his head. And I'm laughing, and Mary Ann's laughing, and Emma's laughing, and Liam just kind of gets up and shakes it off and goes on to say, but I try to do this all the time. You know, not all the time, not every time I see him, because then he'd be on to me, but I try to get him when he doesn't expect it. Like when he's playing basketball. I'm the coach, so I get to sit in the front row, and maybe he runs right down the sideline trying to catch up to the ball, and I just kind of, and down he goes, and he slides, and you hear that sound of skin kind of rubbing off as it sticks on the floor, and he gets up and he's all bloodied, and all the fans are laughing, and you know, he didn't get the ball. Good times, right? Now imagine that Liam comes to me and he says, Dad, I know you get a kick out of this, and I know you love to do this, but I'm kind of getting beat up here. Can we maybe stop the whole tripping thing? Say, oh, Liam, I didn't know you didn't like it. I'm sorry. Yeah, absolutely. I won't do this anymore. And I give him a big hug, and then I wait a day or two, and I get him because he never sees it coming. And he's like, Dad, I thought we weren't going to. And I was like, oh, I thought you'd, like it because you had a break from it. I'm sorry. I won't do it anymore. And then I wait like 2 weeks. So he really doesn't expect it. And he's rollerblading down the sidewalk outside. And I'm just kind of standing there, pretending like I'm working on the lawn or something. Right as he goes by, I jab a stick right into his skates, and boom, down he goes, face all road burned. And I'm just laughing. Now, at some point, would Liam develop trust issues? Yes, he would. You see, it's hard to obey someone if you don't trust them. Because now Liam, every time I tell Liam to do something, he's going to ask, does Dad have my best interests in mind? And his experience is going to tell him, I'm not sure he does.